Good morning, guys. I'm glad you are here with me. I wish we were in the classroom together. I'm sure this is going to be a little bit different today just because we are in the habit of having so much conversation and question and answer and debate. But my plan for today is just to get through the two chapters. So the chapter we missed last week because we got involved in such a great conversation, and then we'll go through this week's chapter. And then we'll see where that leaves us. We may end a little bit early today. I don't know about you guys, but it's been a little bit of a week. So anybody else tired? Hands up. Yeah? Yes? Okay. So before we get started, I found this book I'm pretty excited about that I'm reading called Reflections on the Psalms. It's C.S. Lewis. And I wanted to read a little bit of the introduction to you guys because I know we're more than halfway through this class now. But the introduction to this book was really impactful for me because it sounds exactly like what I'm hoping is happening and will continue to happen through this class. So I'm going to read this to you guys, and hopefully it lands with you. And this is what he says about this book. This is not a work of scholarship. I am no Hebraist, no higher critic, no ancient historian, no archaeologist. I write for the unlearned about things in which I am unlearned myself. If an excuse is needed, and perhaps it is, for writing such a book, my excuse would be something like this. It often happens that two schoolboys can solve difficulties in their work for one another better than the master can. When you took the problem to a master, as we all remember, he was very likely to explain what you understood already, to add a great deal of information which you didn't want, and say nothing at all about the thing that was puzzling you. I have watched this from both sides of the net. For when, as a teacher myself, I have tried to answer questions brought me by pupils, I have sometimes, after a minute, seen that expression settle down on their faces, which assured me that they were suffering exactly the same frustration which I had suffered from my own teachers. The fellow pupil can help more than the master because he knows less. The difficulty we want him to explain is one he has recently met. The expert met it so long ago that he has forgotten. He sees the whole subject by now in such a different light that he cannot conceive what is really troubling the pupil. He sees a dozen other difficulties which ought to be troubling him but aren't. In this book, then, I write as one amateur to another, talking about difficulties I have met or lights I have gained when reading the Psalms, with the hope that this might at any rate interest and sometimes even help other inexpert readers. I am comparing notes, not presuming to instruct. So, can you guys take that as like my halfway midpoint introduction to why I wrote a book on the Beatitudes? It just felt like encouragement from the Lord for me that it's okay that I wanted to write something or felt permission to write something on a topic that I'm not an expert in, and you guys have seen that. And I do feel like in our class we've compared notes more than I've instructed. And that I think is beautiful. So I wanted to thank you guys for your participation, but also sort of encourage myself, I guess, a little bit that if C.S. Lewis feels that way, then maybe I can give myself permission to feel that way too. So we're fellow pupils, and we're examining some difficulties and some challenges and some new ideas in different ways together. So, all right. So I'm going to go back and talk through chapter 5, which is called Surrounded with Fruitfulness. And then we'll go on to chapter 6 and do that one as well. So this is the introduction to Surrounded with Fruitfulness. The fact is that very few of us in modern conditions of life know what it is to be really hungry or really thirsty. In the ancient world, it was very different. A working man in Palestine ate meat only once a week. And in Palestine, the working man and the day laborer were never far from the borderline of real hunger and actual starvation. It was still more so in the case of thirst. It was not possible for the vast majority of people to turn a tap and find the clear, cold water pouring into their house. A man might be on a journey, and in the midst of it, the hot wind which brought the sandstorm might begin to blow. There was nothing for him to do but to wrap his head in his burnous and turn his back to the wind and wait, while the swirling sand filled his nostrils and his throat until he was likely to suffocate, and until he was parched with an imperious thirst. In the conditions of modern Western life, there is no parallel at all to that. So then, the hunger which this beatitude describes is no genteel hunger which could be satisfied with a mid-morning snack. The thirst of which it speaks is no thirst which could be slaked with a cup of coffee or an iced drink. It is the hunger of the man who is starving for food, and the thirst of the man who will die unless he drinks. Zephaniah 2:3 says it this way: "Seek God, all you quietly disciplined people who live by God's justice. Seek God's right ways. Seek a quiet and disciplined life. Perhaps you'll be hidden on the day of God's anger." So in reading through, I'm about halfway through this book, C.S. Lewis, thinking through the Psalms, and you guys will hear some of it from Aaron as well in The Heart of David. But we were just reading it together, and C.S. Lewis is talking about how in the Jewish culture, which the psalmist is, a part of, there wasn't really a lot of focus or attention or even thought to the afterlife. That the Jewish Hebraic religious culture really didn't encourage people to think about what happened after life. And he goes into this whole argument about how, some of the language in the Psalms points to people talking about the afterlife, but it's because we're translating it from a Christian perspective where we know that God has heaven for us and that Jesus paid the price for us to go there. But his main point that he makes is that maybe it's God's kindness that he, in the process of introducing himself to us as human beings, that he didn't start by saying, there is an eternal afterlife and you get to come be a part of it with me, because he really wanted himself to be the first thing. What I think he means by that is that if God had said and started with this whole concept of live with me forever in heaven, then that might have become our focus primarily. And that what God was after was a people who sought his face for the sake of his face, who sought his presence for the sake of his presence. It reminds me of a teaching I heard on the Dark Night of the Soul, where John Mark Comer's talking about this phase that some people experience, and I may have said this in class already, but where you get to a certain stage of your apprenticeship to Jesus, and in order to mature you and give you an opportunity to grow, God will remove the feeling, the experience of his hand, his presence. He'll never actually remove his hand or his presence, but he will remove the experience of himself. And that's an important distinction, because what the argument is that gives the believer, the disciple, a chance to grow out of the worship of how we feel when we're in God's presence and into the true worship of God. Does that make sense? You guys can't affirm that it makes sense, but I'm probably going to say that a lot. So, all of that to say, there is something about hungering and thirsting for God that is sort of embroiled in all of this for me, that when Jesus in this beatitude says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for God's righteousness, that he's pointing to this idea. He's not getting at that we're hungering and thirsting for eternal life for ourselves, right? To secure our own salvation, that there's something about Yahweh for the sake of Yahweh in this. So let's read the 5 different translations. of this beatitude. In the Message translation, it says, "You're blessed when you've worked up a good appetite for God. He's food and drink in the best meal you'll ever eat." In the Passion translation, it says, "How enriched you are when you crave righteousness, for you will be surrounded with fruitfulness." In the NLT, it says, "God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be satisfied." The NIV says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." And the Amplified says, "Blessed, joyful, nourished by God's goodness are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, those who actively seek right standing with God, for they will be completely satisfied." So, I wish we were all in the classroom together so that we could have a rousing discussion about righteousness, because I'm imagining Paul and James and Ben and several other people having one kind of thought about it, and I'm on a different end of the spectrum, and we're all having a great debate about what righteousness looks like. So we'll get into that in a little while, but I want to hold on to this actively seeking right standing with God. There's a lot in that, so hang on to that in the back of your mind. So I'm going to read you guys the climbing companion story. She had only been full one time in her life, on a day when an older woman gave her the leftovers from a feast day. She had received the basket of food gladly, found a quiet corner to sit down, and had enjoyed every bite slowly and deliberately, in spite of the ache in her belly. She had been 12 years old on that day, and for the next 8 years she lived in a perpetual state of near starvation. Her father had left the family when she was very young. The shame and grief had all but killed her mother. In order to keep her daughter alive, she had turned to all manner of work, some legitimate and some less so. Whatever light remained in the woman's eyes quickly vanished. As she grew up, the girl discovered that she had a talent for finding things. A builder needed a certain kind of material, and she could track it down. One of the teachers in town needed a particular fabric that was difficult to purchase, and she was able to find the right vendor in the marketplace. So she did what she could do to earn an honest living, refusing to beg or steal in spite of the constant gnawing hunger that kept her from sleeping some nights. And she put an extra portion of food on her mother's plate whenever she could. It was the darkness in her mother's eyes that drove her to seek goodness in all things. She would sit in the streets and listen to the religious leaders teach the law whenever she could, and prayed constantly that Yahweh would find her heart to be in right standing with his. She prayed for the smile to return to her mother's face and her father to return to their home somehow. And yet at night she could not help but feel herself alone and orphaned. When the opportunity came to hear the incredible teacher from Nazareth speak, she climbed the hillside eagerly, ignoring the weakness in her legs. She found a spot in the warm sun and listened with all her might as his voice reverberated over the crowds. And she could hardly believe it when he looked her full in the face and said, "How enriched you are when you crave righteousness, for you will be surrounded with fruitfulness." She imagined herself in an orchard and nearly burst into song. All right, so let's talk through this. So, righteousness can also be translated as goodness or justice, as we've seen in the different translations included in the book. And how I'm reading this right now in my season of life, as someone who's comparing notes with you and not seeking to instruct, I'm seeing Jesus congratulating those who seek right standing with God in a way that compels them to understand his heart rather than the law. What I mean by that is, if you put it in context with everything we've talked about, that he begins with, feel your spiritual poverty, know that you don't have any way to purchase your ticket into the kingdom. I'm hinging my understanding of the rest of these on that, because like we've said over and over, order matters in Hebrew, and the fact that that's the first thing means that it informs everything else. So what does that mean when we say righteousness? We crave, we hunger and thirst for righteousness, for right standing with God. Well, that means that my heart aches to be aligned with Yahweh's, in my opinion. It means that I've laid down any any thought that I could get myself into right standing, that I could earn the gold star from the Lord. Does that make sense? That there's no way for me to say I've followed all the commandments so well, so perfectly, that I am actually in right standing, and whatever benefits that carries. What I hear Jesus saying more than that is, when you hunger and thirst for righteousness, when you're starving on a visceral level and thirsting in a way that would actually ache and hurt for God's goodness, for his justice, for right standing with him, in the context of I have nothing to bring to the table myself, I hear an invitation into the heart of the Father. I hear an invitation to be like, what is it that I can align myself with about the Lord? Is it his law primarily, or is it his heart? Is the law a way to grapple with and understand what his heart is for me? So can I lay down that as like my safety net and instead say, what is it that God feels about these things? What is it that God desires to see in the world? How can I draw nearer to his heart? And as a parent, I think I learn about this every single day, that when I want my children to be in right standing with me, which I do, part of the reason I'm so exhausted today is because my children are not in right standing with me right now, because distance learning is hard, guys. But when I want my children to be in right standing with me, it's not because they've obeyed my rules out of some dead sense of duty. It's because they understand who their mom is and who their mom sees them to be. And they're inspired by my love and their love to draw nearer to that vision. And I hear Jesus talking about that, right standing. You're aching to be aligned with God's heart. I also love that there's this promise of fruitfulness. It makes me think of the fruit of the Spirit, at least in the Passion Translation. Sorry, gentlemen. Which says, how enriched you are when you crave righteousness, for you will be surrounded with fruitfulness. So if you're comparing notes with me and you're willing to hold the possibility that righteousness carries with it all these things we already know about it, but also this like aligning yourself with the heart of God and coming nearer to it. And that's right standing, means near standing. It reminds me of the fruit of the Spirit, and that aligning yourself with Yahweh's heart, then we find ourselves surrounded by love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, because we crave God's heart. Not because we are following a step-by-step, this is how to bear fruit. Not because we think if I do these things, then I will secure my salvation, but because our true desire is God, and not even the feeling we get from God. I mean, I know that for myself, some of the most difficult times of worship have been the nights or the days when I haven't felt anything, when I feel like I've gone to the Lord in a moment of weakness or trial, and I haven't felt that sense of like what happens at a Seek night, right? When you just get like all hyped up. And yet what I end up hearing from him is that those are the times when I'm closest to really worshiping him, because it's devoid of this like, oh, I get filled with emotion, and it really is a pouring out at his feet. So the word for fruitfulness is nesbun. I can't say it very well, but so it has to do with planting and fruitfulness. So I'm thinking, okay, planting. You're surrounded by fruitfulness and planting, which means I'm actually creating structures and orchards for future generations. Like the fruit is so lasting, it's multi-generational. Does that make sense? When I crave God's heart and I align myself with what he thinks and feels and desires and who he is, his character, and then the law becomes like a secondary piece of that experience. I'm not saying do away with the law at all. Jesus didn't. I'm not saying that either. I'm just saying we're seeking God's presence and connection to his heart more than anything. Then we're actually pouring out seeds and planting things. At least that's part of what I hear in some of these translations. There's a promise of satisfaction attached to this congratulatory blessing, and I think that might be connecting us to the satisfaction promised in Psalm 23. So here's what that says. The Lord is my best friend and shepherd. I always have more than enough. He offers a resting place for me in his luxurious love. His tracks take me to an oasis of peace, the quiet brook of bliss. That's where he restores and revives my life. He opens before me pathways to God's pleasure and leads me along in his footsteps of righteousness so that I can bring honor to his name. You become my delicious feast even when my enemies dare to fight. You anoint me with the fragrance of your Holy Spirit. You give me all I can drink of you until my heart overflows. So I hear it an almost prophetic answer to this beatitude. When you hunger and thirst for God, he becomes our delicious feast. Even when there's turmoil and those around us dare to be in chaos and discord, he anoints us with the fragrance of the Holy Spirit and gives us all we can drink of him until our heart overflows. So do you see the promise of satisfaction that's connected in these two things? That we are hungering and thirsting in a real visceral, almost starvation kind of way for the presence and the heart posture of God. We want to align ourselves with that. And when we do that, he becomes a feast and an overflowing drink. So there's just this beautiful language of the way that God fulfills this desire in our hearts. So I have some questions for you guys. And the first is, what does it mean to be in right standing with God? So if we're going to say that that's part of the definition of righteousness, right standing with God, what does that mean? What does it entail? Does it look like a checklist, right? Like, okay, I haven't murdered anybody. I've honored my parents. I haven't committed adultery. I didn't envy or covet my neighbor's donkey. I'm doing really well. I am in right standing with God. But we're missing the heartbeat there, right? So it must be both. It must be, yes, there's a list of laws and behaviors that come out of a heart connected to the vine. But I think Jesus is trying to flip it on its head again and say, what would you be if you were called out of this focus on the law? So I'm actually, if you guys are okay, sorry, I guess I can't bend down and keep talking. It's not going to pick it up. I kind of want to just read you a little bit of this C.S. Lewis book. Hope that's okay. It's a little long. I'm going to read you a full chapter because we have time. But this is the one I read this morning, and it's just so beautifully connected in my own mind to this idea. And so bear with me, because C.S. Lewis is very British, and so he interjects in his own sentences quite a lot, so they get kind of choppy. So I'm going to do my best to read it in a way that helps make sense. But please don't tune out. I think that there's something really beautiful available in this chapter for all of us. So this chapter is called The Fair Beauty of the Lord. So he spent all these first 4 chapters talking about all the hard things in the Psalms, like death and cursing and judgment, and they're all really beautiful chapters. If you are interested, I would happily lend you this book. But so he starts this chapter and says, "Now let us stint all this and speak of mirth. So far, I couldn't help it. This book has been what the old woman in Scott described as a called clatter o' morality. At last we can turn to better things. If we think mirth an unsuitable word for them, that may show how badly we need something which the Psalms can give us, perhaps better than any other book in the world." And you guys know my heart for play and delight, so I think that's what he's pointing at. And so he says, David, we know, danced before the ark. He danced with such abandon that one of his wives, presumably a more modern, though not a better type than he, thought he was making a fool of himself. David didn't care whether he was making a fool of himself or not. He was rejoicing in the Lord. This helps to remind us at the outset that Judaism, though it is the worship of the one true and eternal God, is an ancient religion. That means that its externals and many of its attitudes were much more like those of paganism than they were like all of that stuffiness, all of that regimen of tiptoe tread and lowered voice, which the word religion suggests to so many people now. In one way, of course, this puts a barrier between it and us. We should not have enjoyed the ancient rituals. Every temple in the world, the elegant Parthenon at Athens and the Holy Temple at Jerusalem, was a sacred slaughterhouse. Even the Jews seem to shrink from a return to this. They have not rebuilt the temple, nor revived the sacrifices. But even that has two sides. If temples smelled of blood, they also smelled of roast meat. They struck a festive and homely note as well as a sacred. When I read the Bible as a boy, I got the idea that the Temple of Jerusalem was related to the local synagogues, very much as a great cathedral is related to the parish churches in a Christian country. In reality, there is no such parallel. What happened in the synagogues was quite unlike what happened in the temple. The synagogues were meeting houses where the law was read and where an address might be given, often by some distinguished visitor. The temple was a place of sacrifice, the place where the essential worship of Yahweh was enacted. Every parish church is the descendant of both. By its sermons and lessons, it shows its ancestry in the synagogue. But because the Eucharist is celebrated and all other sacraments administered in it, it is like the temple. It is a place where the adoration of the deity can be fully enacted. Judaism without the temple was mutilated, deprived of its central operation. Any church, barn, sick room, or field can become the Christian's temple. The most valuable thing the Psalms do for me is to express that same delight in God which made David dance. I am not saying that this is so pure or so profound a thing as the love of God reached by the greatest Christian saints and mystics. But I am not comparing it with that. I am comparing it with the merely dutiful church-going and laborious saying our prayers to which most of us are, thank God not always, but often, reduced. Against that, it stands out as something astonishingly robust, virile, and spontaneous, something we may regard with an innocent envy and may hope to be infected by as we read. So I think what he's saying is that there's a wildness about ancient Judaism that we are not really connected to anymore, that it's something astonishingly robust, virile, and spontaneous. For the reason I have given, this delight is very much centered on the temple. The simpler poets do not, in fact, distinguish between the love of God in what we might call a spiritual sense and their enjoyment of the festivals in the temple. We must not misunderstand this. The Jews were not, like the Greeks, an analytical and logical people. Indeed, except the Greeks, no ancient peoples were. The sort of distinction which we can easily make between those who are really worshiping God in church and those who enjoy a beautiful service for musical, antiquarian, or merely sentimental reasons would have been impossible to them. We get nearest to their state of mind if we think of a pious modern farm laborer at church on Christmas Day or at the harvest Thanksgiving. I mean, of course, one who really believes, who is a regular communicant, not one who goes only on these occasions and is thus a pagan, practicing pagan piety, making his bow to the unknown and at other times forgotten on the great annual festivals. The man I picture is a real Christian, but you would do him wrong by asking him to separate out at such moments some exclusively religious element in his mind from all the rest. From his hearty social pleasure in a corporate act, his enjoyment of the hymns and the crowd, his memory of other such services since childhood, his well-earned anticipation of rest after harvest or Christmas dinner after church. They are all one in his mind. This would have been even truer of any ancient man, especially of an ancient Jew. He was a peasant, very close to the soil. He had never heard of music or festivity or agriculture as things separate from religion, nor of religion as something separate from them. Life was one. This, of course, laid him open to spiritual dangers which more sophisticated people can avoid. It also gave him privileges which they lack. Thus, when the psalmists speak of seeing the Lord or long to see him, most of them mean something that happened to them in the temple. The fatal way of putting this would be to say they only mean they have seen the festival. It would be better to say, if we had been there, we should have only seen the festival. Thus, in 68, it is well seen, O God, how thou goest. In the sanctuary, the singers go before, the minstrels follow after. In the midst are the damsels playing the timbrels. It is almost as if the poet said, look, here he comes. If I had been there, I should have seen the musicians and the girls with the tambourines. In addition, as other things, I might or might not have felt the presence of God. The ancient worshiper would have been aware of no such dualism. Similarly, if a modern man wished to dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of his life, to behold the fair beauty of the Lord, he would mean, I suppose, that he hoped to receive frequent moments of spiritual vision and the sensible love of God. But I suspect that the poet of the psalm drew no distinction between beholding the fair beauty of the Lord and the acts of worship themselves. When the mind becomes more capable of abstractions and analysis, this old unity breaks up, and no sooner is it possible to distinguish the right from the vision of God than there is a danger of the right becoming a substitute for and a rival to God himself. So this is what this has all been building up to, and I really want to focus on. When the mind becomes more capable of abstraction and analysis, this old unity breaks up. And no sooner is it possible to distinguish the right from the vision of God than there is a danger of the right becoming a substitute for and a rival to God himself. I think we can see this in the law sometimes. Once it can be thought of separately, it will, and it may then take on a rebellious, cancerous life of its own. There is a stage in a child's life at which it cannot separate the religious from the merely festal character of Christmas or Easter. I have been told of a very small and very devout boy who was heard murmuring to himself on Easter morning a poem of his own composition which began, "Chocolate eggs and Jesus risen." This seems to me, for his age, both admirable poetry and admirable piety. But of course the time will soon come when such a child can no longer effortlessly and spontaneously enjoy that unity. He will become able to distinguish the spiritual from the ritual and festal aspect of Easter. Chocolate eggs will no longer be sacramental. And once he has distinguished, he must put one or the other first. If he puts the spiritual first, he can still taste something of Easter in the chocolate eggs. If he puts the eggs first, they will soon be no more than any other sweetmeat. They have taken on an independent and therefore a soon withering life. So think about that in terms of righteousness and God's heart. So if we look at righteousness and right standing with God and the law as there's a unity to that, we were probably able to do that for a while. But because we can think of things abstractly and analyze them more, we see that there is separation in some ways. And so what happens then is we have to put one before the other. We just have to. Which one is in the hierarchy? Or at least this is what C.S. Lewis is saying. Chocolate eggs and Jesus risen, right? Law and God's heart, they are intertwined and indivisible, and yet we think of them as divisible in some ways. So I would say that the law is like chocolate eggs, Jesus risen is God's heart. If we put God's heart first, the spiritual piece, then the law retains that sacramental, sacred piece. If we put the law first, then it takes on an independent and therefore soon withering life. Either at some period in Judaism or else in the experience of some Jews, a roughly parallel situation occurred. The unity falls apart. The sacrificial rites become distinguishable from the meeting with God. This does not unfortunately mean that they will cease or become less important. They may, in various evil modes, become even more important than before. They may be valued as a sort of commercial transaction with a greedy God who somehow really wants or needs large quantities of carcasses and whose favors cannot be secured on any other terms. Worse still, they may be regarded as the only thing he wants, so that their punctual performance will satisfy him without obedience to his demands for mercy, judgment, and truth. To the priests themselves, the whole system will seem very important simply because it is both their art and their livelihood. All their pedantry, all their pride, all their economic position is bound up with it. They will elaborate their art more and more. And of course, the corrective to these views of sacrifice can be found within Judaism itself. The prophets continually fulminate against it. Even the Psalter, though largely a temple collection, can do so. As in Psalm 50, where God tells his people that all this temple worship, considered in itself, is not the real point at all, and particularly ridicules the genuinely pagan notion that he really needs to be fed with roast meat. If I were hungry, do you think I would apply to you? That's Psalm 50:12. I have sometimes fancied he might similarly ask a certain type of modern clergyman, if I wanted more music, if I were conducting research into the more recondite details of the history of the Western Rite, do you really think you are the source I would rely on? So I won't read the rest of this because there's a lot more, but I just wanted to get into that place and point to what I think C.S. Lewis is saying, and I think there's value in it when we're thinking about right standing with God, is that life actually is one, and the law and God's heart actually are all intertwined, and because the law came out of God's heart, right? But that we, in our modernity, we separate them in order to analyze and abstract them. And then we have to choose one or the other to go first. I do think if we choose God's heart first, it allows for the sacramental joy to remain on the law. But if we put the law first over the heart that created it, then we do miss something. But you can email me later if you disagree. Okay, second question. What do you see in the word picture of being surrounded by fruitfulness? So I always want to be mindful of the language and the literary beauty of the biblical translations. And I think there really is a word picture, surrounded by fruitfulness. To me, it's not that you're just surrounded by fruit. It is that you are surrounded by life that bears fruit. And so in my mind, that looks like a group of people that come connected to you, who then your connection to God's heart leads them into the presence, and then they become fruitful. And so you become this like orchard of living like trees, like it says in scripture, whose leaves never fall, and all of those beautiful things. So I want you to consider, I'm so sorry, give me 1 second, make sure this isn't my kids. What does it mean to be nourished by God's goodness? What does it mean to hunger and thirst for God's goodness and then to be nourished by that? I think that's really powerful, because I think it speaks to his character, that we're not nourished by God's goodness made manifest in our lives and proven in blessing, right? Like, I don't get satisfied and nourished by God giving me what I want. And then I say, God's good because he gave me what I want. I seek God's heart and understand he's good. He's good because he's good. He's good because he's good. And that's nourishment for me. God's character becomes the feast and the drink, not the proof of his character in my life, if that makes sense. How do you imagine yourself hearing this blessing if you were craving justice? So I want you at some point to put yourself in the shoes. Maybe you are craving justice. I am. I have things I'm petitioning the Lord for justice. And I believe, I wish we were in class together. There's more in this book about justice, and he's talking about how the Jewish people would have thought about justice differently than Christians do. That the Jewish people, the Hebraic culture, would have thought of justice, God's justice, more like a civil case where they're getting what was taken from them restored to them, and they are actually the what's the word? Not the defendant, but the person who's actually like coming and making a case to get things restored to them. I can't think of the word right now. Forgive me. Whereas Christians tend to think of God, we think God's justice we think of it more as like a criminal case where we're on trial, which I thought was really interesting. So the point C.S. Lewis makes is that God becomes a champion. The word connection there is that a lawyer or someone who actually tried cases the word is connected to champion. So and got things restored to people. So of course the ancient Jews were celebrating and petitioning God for his justice, because it meant we get to get everything restored to us. There was this assumption that they would win something back, not that they would go on trial, which I thought was really interesting and challenging to think about what we might be missing in our Christian conception. Not that we're wrong, but there's a beautiful flavor to add that the trial looks more like we get to take a case before the Lord rather than we're on trial for our character. Anyway, I'm going to get myself into trouble there. James, are you like rolling on the floor furious right now? I'm sorry. All right. So, but how do you imagine yourself hearing that blessing if you were craving justice, right? If you were craving the restoration of something to you, and that was what you thought God was bringing. You thought Yahweh will come and he will bring justice, and what I have lost will be restored to me. And Jesus says, blessed are you when you crave God's heart, right standing with God's heart, for you will be surrounded with fruitfulness. You will be filled. So my last two questions are, how can we find Yahweh's heart in this welcoming statement when he says Makarios, welcome to the kingdom, congratulations, blessed, you're blessed, you already are. I was thinking more about our conversation about Makarios last week, and I thought, isn't it a beautiful way to say it is finished? Congratulations is a beautiful way to say the work is done. So I think that is what I mean when I really lean heavily on the congratulatory part of it, that maybe that's Jesus's message all the time. The work is finished. It's done. Congratulations. You're in. What does this beatitude tell us about the kingdom of heaven? Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to give you guys a 5-minute break, and then we'll do chapter 6, and then we'll be done. All right, we'll be back in 5 minutes. Cool. Thanks. Welcome back, guys. Okay, so just to clarify, I did go back and do week 5 because we didn't go through it last week because we were chatting about the wrath of God. Just kidding. That's not where it started. But so now we're going to do chapter 6, which is this week's. And then I'm actually just going to kind of teach through the book. And then what I'd like to do is give you guys some time for the rest of the class period to go back through and really consider, like, pick 2 or 3 questions from these 2 chapters and really work through them. That's what I would love to see you guys do. Since we didn't get to have like a conversation today, then next week when we do this, I'll set up with Matt and we'll do like a live Zoom so we can have class the way we normally do and have a conversation. But I did just kind of want to take this week as an opportunity to catch up a little bit, and then next week we can do a little bit more Q&A. Okay? If that doesn't answer the questions, throw something in the chat. And Matt, can you maybe just like throw your hand up and let me know? Okay, cool. Thanks. All right. So satisfaction in tender mercy. This is one of my favorites. All right. So blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. In the footnotes of the Passion Translation, sorry, James and Ben, Brian Simmons says that tender mercy can also mean merciful to forgive. The Hebraic and Aramaic concept of mercy is that it comes from our innermost being, and the root word for mercy is the root word for womb. When Jesus speaks this welcome blessing over his followers, they might have understood this to mean that how we live will dictate how God deals with us. Indeed, this is even suggested in some translations of Psalm 18, but perhaps there's even more to this statement, more that would point us back to Yahweh and his description of himself. In Exodus 34, Yahweh reveals himself to Moses, saying, Yahweh, the Lord, the God of compassion and mercy. I am slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. I lavish unfailing love to 1,000 generations. We discover Yahweh through the fatherly compassion and the motherly mercy in his revelation statement. And it's possible that Jesus is reminding us that when we extend a merciful hand, we experience Yahweh's character as it passes through us and envelops the other through the vessel of our choice. Okay, so here are the translations. You guys ready? You're blessed when you care. At the moment of being careful, you find yourselves cared for. That's the message. The Passion Translation says, how satisfied you are when you demonstrate tender mercy, for tender mercy will be demonstrated to you. And the NLT says, God blesses those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. The NIV says, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. And then the Amplified says, blessed, content, sheltered by God's promises are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. So I think the main piece I'm kind of grappling with myself and is the promise really that if I behave a certain way, then God will deal with me that way. Like my mercy earns God's mercy. I don't really think that's what Jesus is pointing at here. I'm trying to get myself more to a place where I think they will be shown mercy means I will literally experience God's merciful heart when I embody it myself. When I show mercy, when I live in and express tender mercy, the motherly womb carrying of someone else, then I get to know a part of God that maybe other people don't. So I'm going to read you the climbing companion story. He had waited for his day before the judge for weeks. His neighbor, the coward and thief, had taken too much from him this time for the offense to be overlooked. Originally, it was just ladling water out of his pails to avoid a trip to the well. Next, he caught the other man taking heads of grain out of his field. His neighbor had insisted that he would repay the debt if they could avoid going before a judge, and he had agreed. And the debt had never been paid. Finally, he came home one evening to find his door propped open and a good amount of food missing from inside. Instantly, he knew what had happened, and he stormed across the road to confront the neighbor. At the other man's house, he instantly felt less conviction. The man met him outside with hands raised in a gesture of peace, insisting that he had not taken a thing from the home, but only gone inside to leave behind a bag of grain to repay what he had taken so many weeks ago. The man's young children watched with wide eyes. He had returned home feeling vindicated in his decision to seek a judgment. But as the days wore on, he felt his resolve weaken. The children were clearly hungry. He had enough to spare a few items, if only the neighbor would ask instead of stealing and then denying his actions. It felt like an affront to his generosity that the other man would not trust him with a request for help. That morning, as he had walked purposefully toward his destination, he had found himself following a huge crowd of people, all chattering about the rabbi from Nazareth and his teaching on the kingdom of heaven. Curious and with time to spare, the man had followed. Once everyone had found a seat on the hillside, the rabbi also sat and began to speak a message that challenged every belief in his heart. And then he found himself gazing directly into the young rabbi's face as he said, "How satisfied you are when you demonstrate tender mercy, for tender mercy will be demonstrated to you." He spent the rest of the day in the sun and the breeze listening to Jesus and missed his judgment entirely. All right, so here are the 5 points I kind of want to mull over. The first is that Jesus welcomes the merciful into the kingdom, right? Makarios, welcome to the kingdom. When you demonstrate tender mercy, and promises that they will experience Yahweh's character. That's the main piece I'm taking away from this. Not that it's the only thing. I want to keep coming back to that over and over again. I'm not teaching this as instruction, saying this is what this beatitude means. I'm just saying this might be a place where we can deepen what God's saying to us relationally. So I think that there's something of that we get to demonstrate tender mercy, and then we get it shown to us. We literally get to be the vessel that allow ourselves to experience Yahweh's character. Does that make sense? When I say, okay, I'm going to extend my hand the way Jesus did, Yahweh in the flesh. I'm going to extend my hand in tender mercy, in womb caring, in motherly kindness, and I'm going to be merciful. And then I get to experience God in myself. Does that make sense? Okay. I think this is less of a promise of mercy earned and more of a promise of mercy experienced, that we get to live in the reality of what mercy looks like and what it does for everyone involved in a situation. I don't know about you guys, but I know a couple people who really struggle with mercy and grace, and it's very, very hard to feel safe in those kinds of relationships. I can extend all the grace and mercy that I want, but they have a hard time receiving it, and they have a very hard time extending it. But I also know people who operate in so much grace and mercy, so much tender mercy. It's outrageously kind. And what happens is it calls the best up out of me, actually. It calls up that like tenderness and softness in a place of relational equity and heart. So I think that Jesus is challenging his audience to reframe mercy through tenderness, because mercy can mean to stoop to an inferior. That's one of the ways that it's described. But I think using that language of inferior can sometimes create this like pride or a separation between the two. So tacking on or including tenderness then reminds us that the root word, right, mercy and womb, is really a relational word. Mercy is about relationship. It's not about I am here and you are here and there's no like relational context. This is just an act of forgiveness. It's like, no, I'm drawing into a character piece of Yahweh's and I'm carrying it in myself. And so I'm entering into the kingdom and I'm becoming like my God. The merciful are sheltered by God's promises. They are shielded by by Yahweh's character. This sounds like a future hope, but it's also a present blessing. In the moment we extend mercy, we experience the kingdom. So most of the Beatitudes, like we've talked about, carry a future blessing. You will be shown mercy, right? Mercy will be demonstrated to you, but I think it's both. You will experience Yahweh's mercy, but you are also currently experiencing Yahweh's mercy in your own actions. What an incredible truth and reality, right? Like now I just want to go be merciful all the time and be like, Yahweh's here, Yahweh's here. I like it. Okay, so this is a quote from John Mark Comer's book, God Has a Name. When God describes himself, he doesn't start with how powerful he is or how he knows everything there is to know, or how he's been around since before time and space, and there's no one else like him in the universe. That's all true, but apparently, to God, it's not the most important thing. When God describes himself, he starts with his name. Then he talks about what we call character. He's compassionate and gracious, merciful. He's slow to anger. He's abounding in love and faithfulness, and on down the list. So doesn't it make sense that Yahweh in the flesh, in Jesus, would focus on this character piece, right? Compassion and grace, or compassion and mercy. So here are your questions to consider today. How can you take shelter in Yahweh's character? You can read Exodus 34 verses 4 through 7 and write out all those character pieces. I would encourage you, obviously, I'm going to encourage you to read it in several different translations. Unfortunately, there's no Passion Translation of Exodus yet, so I'm sorry about that. But I would encourage you, if this is the one you want to tackle, read through Exodus 34 verses 4 through 7 in multiple translations. Write out the character traits, and then ask yourself, how do I take shelter? How can this become a structure around me where I can live and be kept safe and secure? Is this a promise of reward for good behavior? If you extend mercy, mercy will be extended to you. Is God promising an exchange? I don't know. Let's see what you guys think. Why does Jesus include the word tender to describe mercy? So I gave you a thought of mine, but I would challenge you to think about it yourself. What does it mean to have mercy demonstrated to you? How often do you get caught up in keeping record of your own forgiveness? Is this reflective of Jesus' heart? What I mean by that is, how often do you think, I've forgiven that over and over again? Or I've been forgiven this so many times. How could I possibly ask for forgiveness again? How many times do we get caught up in the task of keeping records? Either of how many times we've forgiven, how many times we've been forgiven, both. So think through that. And is it reflective of Jesus' heart? And then finally, why is mercy connected to the womb? All you men are like, oh, but I think it's a valuable question to ask. Why is mercy connected to the womb? Okay. So because I am fighting some allergies and my throat is bothering me, we're going to wrap up for today. And I also just want to give you guys some time to choose a couple of those questions and talk them through. If you guys want to discuss with each other, please feel free. Come in with guns blazing next week, and we'll have some Zoom question and answer time. And all of this is fair game. Chapter 5, Chapter 6, and Chapter 7 next week. You can bring any questions, challenges, comments, things God's revealed to you. I would love it if you came prepared to talk about what you're hearing from the Lord and your own heart. So thanks for attending today, guys, and I hope you're all well, and I will see you. I actually think I'll see you tomorrow morning for class, but I will double check. Either way, I'll see you tomorrow or Tuesday. Bye, guys.